Hello everybody, this is Michelle Fox and welcome back to The Simple Quilter. Today's topic is quilt retreats, and this happens to be one of my favorite topics related to quilting. I absolutely love going to quilt retreats. Now this year I haven't been able to go to any and I've really missed them. In fact, my favorite one is being held this weekend. I didn't get to go, but I do get to talk about them a little bit. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is what is a quilt retreat. Now years ago people got together in large buildings to sew for long periods of time. However, at that time it was called a sweatshop and people worked really hard and got paid very little, if anything at all, to work in these sweatshops. Now the interesting thing is today people get together in large buildings and sew for hours, yet we pay someone else to get to go do that. Isn't that ironic? But anyway, they are lots of fun. A quilt retreat can be just a few people, 4 or 5 people, or clear up to 150. Some quilt retreats are held on cruises. Some are just held in people's homes. A quilt retreat can really take place just about anywhere. The next topic I want to talk a little bit about is where quilt retreats are held and who organizes them. Now, quilt retreats, like I just mentioned, can be held in your home. They can be held in a community facility like a church or a college, a hotel, or something like a public activity center. There are lots of places where quilt retreats can be held, or more and more quilt shops are having retreat centers, and there are just retreat centers without quilt shops. So those are the places that you can find them. Now, who organizes them? You can actually organize a quilt retreat if you would like. I've helped our local quilt guild in the past organize quilt retreats, and the past few years I've just helped someone else organize those quilt retreats. You can check with your local quilt guild. They usually host 1 or 2 quilt retreats a year. Our local quilt guild hosts 1 a year, and that is held at our community college with a really nice venue. Sometimes they've had it at the church where we have our meet. Check with your local quilt guild to see if they're having any retreat. Another place you can check to find quilt retreats is your local quilt shop. And if you live in a big place, you might have more than one. Sometimes those local shops will host a quilt retreat, or they will have advertisements of other people who are hosting quilt retreats. One time I did visit a local quilt shop and she had an advertisement for a retreat in Texas, and I did go to that one and it was a lot of fun. And when I can, I still continue to go to that one, and they host 2 a year, so check with your local quilt shops for that too. And then you can just check with your local quilters, your friends. A lot of quilters go to several quilt retreats a year. I go to either 3 or 4, maybe sometimes 5 a year, and I do try to stay local. There are some that I'd like to go to. One's near Bryce Canyon in Utah. I'd love to go somewhere beautiful, but I do kind of stick with our local quilt shop so I don't have to take time off work and I don't have to spend lots of time traveling. I get to spend that time quilting. You can check the internet. Many people advertise their quilt retreats and quilt retreat centers on the internet, and sometimes you can just book one for you and some of your friends, or those facilities will actually host different retreats throughout the year. One that I would also like to go to someday is the Missouri Star Quilt Company Retreat Center. I've been there, but I didn't tour the retreat center, and from what I've seen online, it looks pretty fantastic, so that may be on my to-do list later. Okay, so 2 or 3 years ago, I started collecting information for a presentation for our local quilt guild, and it was on quilt retreats. So one year I put together a little survey, and just every time I went to a quilt retreat, I asked all the attendees to fill it out. It just listed, I just wanted them to list their top 10 reasons for attending a quilt retreat. And I'm going to share some of that information with you now. The number 1 reason why people attended quilt retreats was for friendship. They like to go with their current friends. Sometimes old quilt friends will come to a quilt retreat if they know their other friends will be there, and it's a great place to make new friends. So friendship was the #1 reason for attending quilt retreats. The next reason was to get something done. A lot of times quilters don't have time to do lots of quilting at home when they're working full time or when they have domestic responsibilities and children to take care of. So when you go on a quilt retreat, you do get time to sew. And sometimes you can sew from 8 in the morning till 11 at night, depending on, how long the sewing room is open at the quilt retreat. So you should be able to have lots of time to get stuff done. The next reason is to escape from those domestic responsibilities from work and all the things you have to do at home, to have a little vacation or a little getaway. They truly are like mini vacations because you're not having to worry about cooking or cleaning or figuring out what you're going to wear for work tomorrow. You don't have to do any of that. The next reason for going to a quilt shop is to learn new ideas. Quilters are great about sharing their ideas with others, so it's fun to see what others are working on and how they're doing their project. The next reason listed is the food. Now, at our local quilt retreat, we always ask the attendees to bring snacks, and the members of our quilt guild are fantastic cooks, and they bring some amazing snacks. In fact, some of those snack tables have just been quite impressive. And then sometimes the facilities that you attend, their meals are really outstanding too. They do a good job on preparing delicious meals for everybody. So the food is a reason that quilters go to quilt retreat. The next reason is to see lots of quilts. And at our local quilt retreat, we usually have a quilt turning or we have a show and share. The last quilt retreat that I did get to go was last year, and in fact they had theirs this weekend, and they had a quilt walk. The quilt retreat is held in a resort, and all the rooms have, several beds in them, and you were to bring a quilt and lay it on your bed to show. And it was so neat to go to each room and hear the quilters talk about their quilts and to see their quilts and to hear their quilt stories. So that was really neat. So usually you have lots of quilts to get to see. The next reason for attending a quilt shop is to learn something new. Many quilt retreats will have a guest instructor who will teach a new technique or a special class. One of the ones that I go to with one of my friends, they have the Judy Niemeyer instructors come, and my friend loves to attend those now. I usually opt out of those. One of the other reasons for attending quilt shops that people listed was laughter. I remember one of the very first quilt retreats I went with one of my friends, quilt friends. Oh my gosh, we laughed so hard. We laughed till early hours of the morning. We laughed on the way home. We laughed while we were there. Oh my gosh, I don't even know when I've ever laughed so much, but there is always lots of laughter, and you really come away from those quilt retreats feeling good and refreshed. So laughter is good for the soul, so that is a good reason to attend a quilt retreat. The next reason is that you get to shop. Now, at one of the quilt retreats that I go to, the very first activity on the quilt retreat is everybody meets up in a town that's close to the retreat, and we visit and shop at the local quilt shop. And that is so much fun to see what everyone else is getting and what they're going to work on. And then from there, we will go eat, and then we head out to the retreat center. And so we do get to shop there. Another quilt retreat that I attend, they have 3 quilt shops come in and set up booths, and they're there the whole weekend so that you can do shopping when you get tired of sewing. So that's really a neat option too. And then some quilt retreats that I've been to, we'll just stop and shop along the way. And another one that I went to, there was a quilt shop and a retreat center there. So, I mean, you had an entire quilt shop to shop from. So that's really neat. And that is, of course, a good reason to go to a quilt retreat. The next reason is inspiration, and there are lots of quilts being made by others to inspire you. However, one of the things that I get inspired by at quilt retreats, I get inspired by how productive some quilters are. They get so much done at these quilt retreats. I'm always amazed, and they inspire me to do more and work more, try to do more quilting at home. So you can go for inspiration, and what a great reason. Another reason is to get help. Again, quilters are great at offering help and assistance to those who need help or new quilters, so it is a good place to go get help if you need it. One of my quilt friends that I go with, she loves to help others, and sometimes she doesn't get much sewing done, but she takes great pleasure in helping others, so there's usually always help at quilt retreats. And the last reason is that you just don't have to cook. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier. If the retreat centers don't provide meals, then there's usually always nice restaurants to go visit while you're there. So quilters typically don't have to do any cooking while they're on quilt retreats. The next topic I want to talk about is preparing for a quilt retreat. Now, when I attend a quilt retreat, I do start to prepare 2 to 3 weeks in advance. And it is just really an important thing to do because you do not want to wait until the night before to plan and pack for a quilt retreat. In fact, I have done that, and it is not pleasant. I end up going to the quilt retreat being disorganized, not having everything I need, and getting very little accomplished. But the quilt retreats where I take time to plan and prepare way in advance, they just go much smoother, and I get a lot more done. The first thing in preparing for a quilt retreat is you need to find the quilt treat that fits you. So you have to kind of decide, do you want to go someplace beautiful? Do you want to spend time traveling? Do you want to spend less money and go to a local quilt retreat that's maybe not so scenic, but you'll get to spend more time quilting and less time traveling? And again, they're not quite as expensive as when you have to travel a long distance to get there. So you just need to find the right quilt retreat for you. And then you need to see if you can get a friend to go with you. To me, that's really important because I've done it both ways, and I always have a much better time when I go with at least one quilt friend. If you're going to a quilt retreat that someone else is hosting, you really need to read their brochure carefully to see what all you need to bring. Sometimes quilt retreat centers ask for you to bring your own linens and own bath towels, so you definitely want to check for that. You also want to see if they are asking you to bring snacks or charm packs or quilt strips for different games they might play. So be sure you're reading those brochures really carefully so you have all the materials that you need for that quilt retreat. You also want to check with the host of the quilt retreat to see what kind of space you will have for your sewing space. Sometimes I've been at quilt retreats where you get a whole table by yourself. Sometimes I've had to share with up to 3 other people, and that did not leave much room at all to sew. So be sure you check with the host to see what type of quilting space you will need, because you may not be able to take as much if your quilting space is very small. You also want to check with your host to see if they provide ironing boards and irons. A lot of quilters will take small portable ironing mats and irons. However, as your quilt pieces get bigger, it is nice to have those bigger irons and ironing boards available. Also, if they provide cutting stations, you don't need to take your big mat. However, you will probably still need to pack your rulers and your rotary cutters. But check with them to see what they will be providing. Another thing that you need to do way in advance of going to a quilt retreat is making sure your sewing machine is clean and in good working order. And I always try to change the needle before I go to a quilt retreat. And of course, I also pack a few extra needles just in case one breaks. So be sure that your sewing machine is ready to go. You need to know what projects you'll be taking, and you need to do this in advance, especially if you need to cut a kit. And if you're going to cut a kit, I recommend that you make a sample block before you cut the whole kit out, just in case there's an error in the cutting instructions. You want to be sure that you can make your blocks with the materials that you'll be taking. So just do a little test run on the block to make sure that everything's okay. And also I put each project in a separate bin. You've seen those here in my quilt room. I've shown those before in my previous videos. Or a project bag. You can even just use a 2-gallon Ziploc bag. Those are really nice to put quilt projects in, but you want to be sure you have those decided upon and ready to go well in advance. And then also I have a bag that is just for hand sewing, and I usually toss that into just in case I have problems with my machine or I just get tired of sewing on the machine. I'll have another project to work on. You also want to be sure all your quilt tools are marked with your initial, or if you can see this is a rotary cutter, and it just has a little key fob on it so that I know this is my rotary cutter. It's just nice to be sure that all of your materials are labeled with your initials or something special so that you'll know which ones are yours. It's easy to get your materials mixed up with others, especially when sewing quarters are really tight. So just be sure your things have your initials on them, and if something gets left behind and they have your initials on them, somebody will know where to return them. I also like to pre-wind several bobbins so I don't have to stop and do that while I'm sewing. If you're taking more than one project and you're not using the same color of thread, be sure you pre-wind those in the colors of thread that you need. And I have been sewing and quilting for a long time, so I have 2 or 3 of almost every quilt supply. I have several rotary cutters, several boxes of pins, I have marking tools, lots of scissors. So what I do with all those extra supplies is I put together a quilt bag that is just for when I leave the house to sew somewhere else. So if I take it camping, or if I have a sew day with our local quilt guild, or if I go on a quilt retreat, that bag is ready to go. So if you have duplicate sewing supplies, you might think of doing that. So then that bag is always ready to go, and you know that you have all of your supplies ready to go. And in that quilt bag, I'll also put things like Kleenex and sticky rollers and my best press, just so that I have everything that I need. Now, I did want to talk a little bit about my t-shirt. It says Quilt across the front. I had somebody make this for me one year before I went to a quilt retreat, and this is my attire for quilt retreats. I don't dress up. I wear comfortable clothing, which usually consists of t-shirts, because I love t-shirts, especially quilt t-shirts, and a comfortable pair of blue jean capris or blue jeans. So anyway, it's always fun to have a quilt themed t-shirt or two to wear. And then I wanted to show you the quilt behind me. This is what I consider my retreat quilt. I made this at one of the quilt retreats I have attended. It's just a fun, beautiful quilt that's whimsical. I think you could read some of the spools on it before, but I'm going to step aside so you can see that. Some of the sayings are, do these fabric make my quarters look fat? She flies with scissors. And I made it several years ago, and just what a fun quilt. And I do want to take that on quilt retreats with me. And then I did want to show you the back. I just took all the leftover fabric that I had, and I had a lot of leftover fabric, and I just used it to make the back, and I just love the way that turned out. Now, if you've enjoyed today's video, please hit the like button, subscribe if you'd like to, hit that notification bell if you'd like to get a notification every time I put out a new video. Leave comments below. I love to get comments from others. And my next video will be part 2 of this one, which will talk about what you need to pack and how you can pack for a quilt retreat. So until then, have fun quilting.